The Mini 5 Pro can produce some incredible results, but if you just use the default settings, you won't be nearly getting the best results possible. So in this video, I'm going to show you the best settings to get the most cinematic footage out of your DJI Mini 5 Pro. And I've made a PDF checklist of the settings in this video. I'll put a link in the description where you can download it for free. So the very first thing you'll want to do is to switch from auto mode into pro mode so that we have full control over the camera settings. So to switch to pro mode, just tap the little camera icon in the bottom right corner of the screen. And then if you tap on the little camera settings numbers, a box will pop up with most of the settings we need to change. So the first thing we'll want to set is our exposure settings. Now by default, it will be set to auto exposure, where the drone will control the shutter speed and ISO automatically. And this can work well if you're in a hurry, but it's not ideal because you have no control over what settings the drone decides to use, and the exposure can change during a shot, which usually doesn't look great. But most of the time you'll want to have manual control over those settings, so you'll want to disable auto on both ISO and shutter. And you'll want to have your ISO set as low as possible for best quality. I keep it set to ISO 100 90% of the time. In low light, you'll have to bump this up to get a bright enough image, but the higher you go, the worse the quality gets and the more noise and graininess you have in your shot. On the Mini 5 Pro, you can go up to ISO 800 and still have a fairly clean image, and I've gotten decent results shooting at night with even higher ISOs with some post-processing noise reduction. Next, you'll want to use the shutter speed to adjust the brightness of your shot. Now ideally you want to follow what's called the 180-degree shutter rule and set the shutter speed to double the frame rate. So for 30 frames per second, that would be 1/60th of a second, because that will give you the most natural motion blur and make your shots look much smoother. But most of the time, setting your shutter speed this low will make the footage look way too bright. And to fix that, you'll need to use ND filters that attach to the camera and cut down the amount of light that comes in. The Mini 5 Pro does come with ND filters in the Fly More combo, but they are limited to only 3 strengths, so you might want to get a set of ND filters with more different strengths like these from Freewell. Now, even if you can't set your shutter speed to exactly double the frame rate, you can still get great shots. You'll just want to be aware that in bright light, you won't be getting proper motion blur. The 180-degree shutter rule makes the most difference when there's a lot of motion in the shot, like if you're flying low and fast or tracking a subject. If you're flying at 400 feet filming a landscape, chances are there won't be any motion that's fast enough to be blurred with a lower shutter speed anyway. Now, one caveat to using manual exposure is that you do get a somewhat higher dynamic range with auto ISO using dual ISO fusion. Now, the dynamic range isn't bad in full manual mode. For most situations, you'll have plenty of dynamic range with manual ISO, and I usually don't worry about it, but for extreme lighting situations like shooting into the sun at sunrise or sunset, you can get a decent dynamic range boost by using auto ISO. And you can get the increased dynamic range in all color profiles, including D-Log-M. So to take advantage of this extra dynamic range without losing all the benefits of manual exposure, you can just set all your camera settings like you would in manual mode. Set the ISO to 200 instead of 100 so dual ISO can work its magic. Set your shutter speed to double the frame rate with an ND filter, and then tap on ISO to change it back to auto. And then to prevent the exposure from changing during your shot, you can lock the exposure by either tapping on the screen, which will bring up a yellow box, and then tapping and holding on that box to lock in the exposure, or you can simply set one of your custom buttons on the remote to auto exposure lock, which will let you lock the exposure with one single button press. So now that we have our exposure settings set, we can click over into the second settings tab on the left, where we can see all of the rest of our settings. So first up, we have white balance, which is basically how warm or cool the shot is. Now you could just leave it to auto and it will do a decent job a lot of the time, but it can change during a shot and sometimes it just simply gets it wrong. So I'd recommend that you turn off auto and set the white balance manually. If it's sunny, you'll want to set the white balance to around 5,600. If it's cloudy, you'll want it on up around 6,200 to 6,500. And at sunrise and sunset, I like to have it around 5,600 or a little bit higher, say 5,800, to make sure I get nice and warm colors. And sometimes if I want to set the white balance very quickly, I'll just click it to auto and then let it set it and then click it back to manual to lock it in. often that will look decent without any extra adjustment. And then next we have resolution and frame rate. You'll want to set the resolution as high as possible, so on the Mini 5 Pro that would be 4K. And then for frame rate, 24 frames per second is considered the most cinematic. But unless you strictly follow the 180-degree shutter rule and always use a 1/50th of a second shutter speed, your 24 frames per second footage will end up looking jittery and not smooth. So in general, I'd recommend sticking to 30 frames per second or 25 frames per second if you're in Europe as your basic frame rate. And you can set it to 60 frames per second for any situations where you might want to slow the footage down. On the Mini 5 Pro, there's really no significant downside to shooting at 60 frames per second besides larger file sizes. And if you really want to slow things down, you can switch over into slow motion mode and choose 4K 120 frames per second. There's also the option to shoot 1080p 240 frames per second, but it's not really good enough quality that I'd actually recommend using it. And 120 frames per second is really slow. So unless you actually have some fast action that you want to slow down, I'd stick to 60 frames per second. And next up we have color profile. Now usually I'd recommend to only ever shoot in D-Log-M or hybrid log gamma, but on the Mini 5 Pro, the normal color profile actually has 10-bit color depth. This gives you more color grading flexibility with normal color profile, and it keeps a surprising amount of the dynamic range in the normal color profile. But while you can get decent quick results straight out of the drone with normal color, you still get a lot more color grading flexibility if you shoot in D-Log-M or hybrid log gamma modes. Between hybrid log gamma and D-Log-M, it's slightly easier to grade HLG footage, and it naturally has more pop in the midtone areas, but both hybrid log gamma and normal color profile do something weird where they'll adjust the contrast and brightness of parts of the image right in the middle of a shot. So D-Log is my preferred color profile for the Mini 5 Pro. Now, both hybrid log gamma and D-Log-M will need to be color graded to look good, and even normal color profile will benefit a lot from color grading. And so if you want to learn how to color grade your footage, I'll link a video in the description where I explain how I color grade my drone shots. So those are all the settings we can access from the main camera settings box. One more thing before we dive into the menus is that you'll want to either use the 1x or 2x zoom settings, because the 2x crop is using the quad Bayer tech to get a pretty surprisingly good quality crop into the sensor. And if you go anywhere in between, you're just using regular digital zoom, which will give you terrible image quality. And a quick tip, if you have the DJI RC2, I have the C2 button on the back set up to switch between the 1x and 2x cameras on the fly without having to use the touchscreen. So then diving into the menus, first we'll go to the control tab, and there are a lot of settings here, but we're going to focus on the ones that are important for getting cinematic footage, which are the gain and expo tuning settings. Here we have settings for how the drone responds to your stick inputs in Cine, Normal, and Sport modes. The default settings here for the Mini 5 Pro are not great, and you'll get a lot smoother footage by updating these settings. Now for Cine mode, I just leave all the settings at default. I don't really use Cine mode that much, and for when I do, the default settings are fine. In normal mode, I have the max horizontal ascent and descent speeds all set to the max angular velocity, which is how fast the drone turns, set to 75 degrees a second, yaw smoothness set at 15, and braking at 100. And the expo settings I set to 0.25 for up and down, 0.15 for yaw, and 0.2 for pitch and roll. And then under gimbal, I have max tilt speed set to 15 degrees a second and smoothness set to 13. And max roll speed is at 7 degrees a second and smoothness is at 13. And then for sport mode, the max horizontal ascent and descent are all at the max, and then max angular velocity is set to 120 degrees a second, and yaw smoothness is set to 15, and brake sensitivity is again at 100. And then under expo, up and down is set to 0.3, yaw is set to 0.15, and pitch roll is set to 0.25. And under gimbal, max tilt speed is at 20 degrees a second and smoothness is at 15. And max roll speed is at 10 degrees a second and smoothness is at 13. Now these aren't the only settings that can work well. You can do your own testing and figure out what settings work best for how you fly, but these are the settings I've found to give the best results. And if you want to learn how to get cinematic drone moves with your Mini 5 Pro, I'll leave a link to my top 10 drone moves down in the description as as well. And then moving over into the camera tab, a lot of the settings here we've already looked at in the home screen camera settings, but there are a few more settings we need to change. First of all, you'll want to enable the histogram, which helps you judge your exposure. In short, you want to have the mountain of data sitting in the middle of the histogram, which means you aren't losing data in either the highlights or the shadows. If you have the mountain of data all bunched up against the right side, it means your exposure is too bright, or if it's all bunched up on the left, it means it's too dark. And then I always have the thirds, grid lines, and center marker turned on. The thirds lines help you compose your shots according to the rule of thirds. Basically, you want to put important parts of your image, like the horizon or a subject, on one of those horizontal or vertical thirds lines. And the center marker is helpful if you want to precisely center something in the frame, or even just to see exactly where you're headed with the drone. And then one last setting here is sharpening and noise reduction settings under style. The default settings will turn fine details in the shadows, for example trees that are fairly far away from the drone, into a big mushy blurry mess because of over aggressive noise reduction. So you'll want to turn both sharpening and noise reduction down to -1. And one more essential setting on the Mini 5 Pro is focusing. With most DJI drones, you don't really have to worry about making sure your shot is in focus, but at least with the current firmware, the Mini 5 Pro has very sensitive autofocus. I learned this the hard way when I shot a bunch of footage flying past trees to reveal a landscape behind, and only when I watched the footage back on my computer did I see that the Mini 5 Pro had focused on the trees and then refocused as I flew past the trees on every single shot and ruined all of those shots. And sometimes it's even refocused in the middle of a shot when I was just flying around. So to avoid this, you'll want to lock your focus, especially when you're flying past things. And to do that, you'll just autofocus by tapping on the screen where you want to focus, usually on the landscape in the distance, and then tap on the button that says AF next to where you switch to the 2x crop mode, which will switch it over to manual focus and lock in your focus. Just remember to switch it back to autofocus by tapping on that same button again when you want to focus on a different subject at a different distance. So there you have my cinematic camera settings for the Mini 5 Pro. This is actually a condensed version of just one of the lessons in my course, so if you'd like to see more drone video tips just like this, check out the Flying Filmmaker course where I have over 70 tutorials showing in depth how I film cinematic drone shots, edit them together into engaging videos, color grade my footage to give it that cinematic look, and more. And you can check that out at flyingfilmmakerpro.com, or if you aren't ready to dive into the full course, I have a completely free training where I share my top 10 secrets to cinematic drone shots. And of course, links to everything will be in the description. And finally, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.